This, we decided to set this up kind of chronological order. Obviously, we start thousands of years ago with Native Americans, and we work our way around the room all the way to the 1960s when Del Webb did the Sun City area. So let's start over here, and I'll show you a few things. This is kind of our Native American. We do know that there were Native American villages close by here. Some of the special items that we find in the area. There's the Ringing Rock. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's over by the Santa Rosa Academy. But here's what's neat. This gentleman is Paul Macaro. He's from Pechanga. He took us out there. And you know, when you hit a big rock, it kind of sounds like that. It just sort of clicks. But when you hit this rock, and we videotaped Paul this, and so Paul's showing us this, and so this is where we got the audio, but it sounds like this. For some reason, that rock has properties that ring like a bell, and so for thousands of years, this was a special place for the Native Americans in this area who discovered that it had that sound and considered it to be special and spiritual, and so they would have ceremonies and things like that there. And right within 100 yards of this are these bedrock mortars that are very close by, and so you know, when you have that many milling sites on a rock, that tells you there were a lot of people that would be gathered at one time, and so that's one of the other ways we can determine that there were gathering areas here and villages close by. There's some other places where we find a lot of flakes, and we find black midden, which is kind of, as you dig down the ground, it's kind of an oily charcoal from years and years of having campfires and cooking and those kinds of things. And so that's kind of a way of determining where these villages were a gathering of the Native Americans. We set this museum up so you can touch things. We don't put anything behind glass, so if you want to kind of touch and feel free, Fred. But some of these things, I mean, imagine how many years that metate was used to be able to grind a hole all the way down in through the bottom of it with a pestle. And we have a lot of other neat things over here. I'll show you. This is called a comal. Obviously, it's got a hole in it, so it's for using a stick to get it out of the fire. The idea is they would grind up some acorns. They would make wee wish, which is kind of a batter, like a pancake batter after it's ground and mixed with water. And so they could put that in a basket, get this baby out of the fire, burnt glowing red, set it in there, and that was basically how they cooked. They could cook fish that way and other things as well. So this, who knows, but it's very special. There's a lot of other things we have here. Manos are usually this oval shape, but they're for working metate and grinding, but some of these are a little special. I'll give this to you. Notice that it's perfectly round. And so this isn't a mono, it's not used for grinding. This was actually for rolling across the ground and used for target practice for bow and arrow, or throwing a spear at it, or rocks and things, projectiles, to teach the young braves and the warriors and the hunters to aim at a moving target and things like that. And so a lot of the games of skill that they had were of that mindset to teach them to aim for where it's going. I'll show you the example. Here's another one for young kids. It's basically made out of acorn rings, but the idea is to try to see how many you could stab. And then we have a lot of nice things that kids would have used. When they do have flakes, are basically, they're going to find an igneous rock that breaks, kind of like one of these that breaks a lot like glass when it's struck, as opposed to a granular rock. And so they'll end up with a piece that they're hitting, and they're breaking until they have a pile of these flakes. They're looking for good candidates to make an arrowhead. They would then find 3 or 4 out of that pile and just scatter the rest. And so today, as we're going out there and you find places where these bedrock mortars are, there also happens to be these piles of man-made. You can see where it was struck and created and broken by finding striking platforms and things like that. But then they would take something like this. This is a deer antler, harder than any rock, and so then they could do what's called flint mapping or pressure flaking to basically chip the corners and shape that into their arrowhead pieces. And we got a lot of neat arrowheads and things that are over here to check out. There's 3 different.
How did you guys acquire?
from various collections that other people had in the area that had come and visited and said, hey, we have some things that we'll loan you. By putting it on loan, it's really not ours, it's theirs. And so it's the right way to have it be able to stay in this museum and not be collected by others. But anyhow, that's kind of how we've collected these things. We also have a gentleman, his name's Paul Price, very smart guy who's been doing this all of his life. So he has taught us about a lot of these Native American things, their lifestyle, their culture, the tools that they would have used. And he kind of didn't say, I'm going to give these things to you, but I'm going to teach you how to either make them or how to find them out in the field. And so we've spent a lot of time with him on weekends putting together these things to create this so that the people that we're teaching can understand some of the uses of them.
Where is he located?
He's in Canyon Lake.
Okay.
Yeah, real close by. Comes by here a lot. One of the things he taught us was that the Native Americans around here were very rhythmic, but they didn't play drums. You know, we see on TV, it's always, you know, drums. Right. And maybe in the middle of the United States, that was something that they did. But here in this area, they were rhythmic, but they would use rattles and things like this. This is made of deer hoofs. And they could tie these around their ankles when they're dancing and things like that. Deer hoof rattles, very, very common in this area, the Native Americans. We try to give a pretty good explanation about why they're called Luiseno Indians. And, you know, when we think of the timeline of Native American occupation in this area, we think 10,000 years. And just this last couple of hundred years, this little part on the timeline was when the Spanish missions were here in the 1700s. And that's when they kind of started to have contact with the Native Americans and bring them to the missions, and it began to change their whole lifestyle. And so there were missions all along the coast, and each mission was assigned an area. And so the Native Americans that were here, Saboba, Pechanga, Pala, Rincon, those were all under the purview of San Luis Rey Mission. And therein lies the name, the Luisenos, after San Luis Rey. So we teach the kids that come here a lot about why they're called Luiseno.
Yeah, I had heard that. That's really interesting.
And the Native American tribes, there were lots of tribes in many villages. In fact, in that Luiseno purview, there might have been as many as 50 different villages from Escondido all the way up to this area here. Wow. And each of them would have their own ideas of culture, and they'd have their own language. So when they meet each other, they had difficulty even communicating. But so when people now say, well, what's the Luiseno word for this or that? Well, it kind of depends, because there were so many different languages spoken within that area. We have a lot of other neat tools, though. There's arrow straighteners, and kind of teach about how fire is made. These three things, these are recreations of pictographs and petroglyphs that are nearby in this area. And the gentleman we were talking about earlier, Harley Garbani, while he was out there doing a lot of his paleontological and archaeological efforts, he was finding a lot of these paintings and petroglyphs, and he could see they were fading. He was fearing that development might end up damaging some of these things and vandalism, and so he took a piece of visqueen plastic and put it out on the field and did retracings in the exact copy, and then brought them back home again and recreated those. So this is a replica, and so is that, and so that of actual nearby paintings and rock art that are out there on those rocks.
Billy, what's the difference between a petroglyph and a pictograph?
A pictograph would be painted, so this is just basically painted using dye and that sort of thing. And then a petroglyph is pecked or scratched into the rock. And so some of these are in the exact same pattern that you see here as replicas of what they have.
Wow.
This is a eagle feather dancing skirt. The males wore that. Even today when you go to some of the powwows, you'll see the men are wearing something very similar to that. And the idea is they jump up and turn as they're jumping, and it would cause the feathers to do kind of a floating, which invokes spirits and stuff during their ceremonial dances. We recreated this. These are turkey feathers that were dipped to look like eagle feathers, but
Julie, you have to have good legs to do that. You know? Do you know anybody that...
They really liked chia, and If you go out in the fields in the springtime, you'll see
Uh-huh.
this plant. It grows natural still here. It is chia, and but basically by shaking these, you get the little chia seeds, and a handful of that chia will sustain you, give you energy, and make you feel full. And so the Native Americans just love finding chia, and they'd fill their baskets and keep pots with chia in it. But it was coveted, and so one tribe would want to say this is our territorial area for our chia. And sometimes they'd find others in there harvesting, and so many of the conflicts that you might read about between the tribes in this area always seem to be over chia. It's like kind of they were messing around with our chia.
Yeah.
So the first European settlers we're going to talk about were gold miners, and obviously the city's namesake, I'm going to move this out of your way so you don't get poked in the eye. Our city's namesake is Luther Menifee Wilson. He came from Kentucky. He ended up in the desert in Calico and also in Ivanpah, where there were tin mines and silver mines and even gold mines. And through marriage, he ended up in San Bernardino. His marriage didn't last, and so he was back nomadic on his own. He comes to Menifee, and he found a quartz lode just up the street from where we are today on the corner of Holland and Marietta Road. And so he was finding gold in there and doing very well. And ultimately, he ended up selling that mine, and the new company, the Allen Mining Company, put in a 5-stamp mill, which would have looked something like this. But basically, they're hoisting out large boulders after blasting and then using the mill to crush it into smaller pieces that could then be put on a mercury or a cyanide process table to extract the actual gold out of it. One of the problems that miners were having in the area is that the water table at that time in the 1880s wasn't very deep. Great for farmers, but not for miners, because once they encounter water, it's hard to get it pumped out of there and to be able to continue operation. But it was noted that mine actually produced over $10,000 worth of gold from the mine right up here. There was also a couple other mines in the area, the Good Hope Mine, the Lucky Strike Mine. They're kind of a little closer towards Paris. And then, Fred, we'd like to say there were 2 gold rushes that happened. There was this gold rush, and Luther Menifee Wilson certainly brought a lot of other miners that were interested in mining for gold. There's a lot of the hills around here. You can see a lot of the shoring and tailings and things like that from activity. But the second gold rush was wheat. And so this kind of brings us into the wheat farming in the 1800s. These are the families, the Christensens, the Kirkpatricks, William Newport, the Brown family and the Borises. They were working very, very hard in those days using horses and harvesters. Can you imagine during harvest time is the summer, and you know what it's like here. It's over 100 degrees in the summer, but they were out there working them. We like to talk to the kids about, well, what is wheat? So we've kind of created these displays, that talk about the health aspects of wheat and what wheat is used for. And so we show them, hey, when you look out the window and you're driving by these fields and you see wheat, it looks like this. But when you shake it real hard, you get some of the little grain seeds that come out. So we let the kids kind of feel the grain and understand that this is the part that we really want. But when you think of the city as 50 square miles, and if it was all fields of wheat, you would end up with a yield something like that, where you've got tens of thousands of tons of grain seeds. And we talk about how it's used and what it's used for. So, and life on the farm, you can't just eat wheat all day long and survive on that. So they obviously had horses, and they raised pigs, and they were beekeepers. They had honey operations here. Kind of a fun story. This gentleman, his name is Mr. Magoon with an N at the end. He would come by on a periodic basis and hit his ooga horn, and he always had things on his truck that he would trade and barter with you. So you may have more eggs than you need. He might have a lot of nuts from one of your neighbors, and so he would come by and kind of kind of help pollinate and share that. And we like to talk a little bit about farm life and what it was like. This is a stove from the 1930s.
Wow.
Yeah, this was a gasoline stove. So prior to this, wood stove, you know, is what they would have always used, and you got to keep that wood stoked. So this was very modern. It was using gas to burn. For a year or two, they actually had gasoline stoves just like we use in our automobile. Later they went to kerosene because it was a little safer and less volatile. But that's how this thing worked, and just with modern convenience in the 1930s.
Where did you get this?
It was donated by one of our local residents who's lived here most of her life. Kate Krupsakis.
Wow.
Right? So what about, where'd the kids go to school? And this is where you're going to have some interest. Where were our schools? And so right on the corner of Newport and Bradley roads, there's today an AM PM right there, but that's where the schoolhouse, the 1890 Menifee schoolhouse was. And it served both high school students. They called it the Vale High School, and then also the Menifee younger grades were there. This is a nice picture here to see. This is the 1890s, that photo, and they're kind of dressed in the little house on the prairie outfits and all, and there's the old school. And then here, this is 1954, and this was a reunion for the students that had gone there, so some of these may even be coming back for a 50-year reunion, and even that photo is fairly old. You'll notice that the belfry that's on the top is no longer in this picture, so it used to have that bell tower up on top. And I think it was 1916, is that right, Eleanor? A bolt of lightning hit the belfry and it came down, crashed outside. Fortunately, none of the kids were outside, so it wasn't a problem, but they set the bell aside and it stayed there for a while until in 1952, when this school was opened. They took that bell and they put it right out in front where you walk through the gate, and it stayed here up until they closed the school. And now, when you go into the lobby of the district office, it's there under glass. It's the same 1890 bell, so we still have that, and we still have the plaque for it. So, kind of neat to see whenever you do go over there. And so there were two schools. There was the 1890 school that I'm talking about, and then there was also the Antelope School, and this is the one that you saw on the map right at Scott Road in the 215 freeway. And this was a one-room schoolhouse. Here's a picture of the students. So you would have had first graders all the way up into the 8th graders, all being taught by one teacher in the same classroom. So she's teaching.
That was my grandmother in Arkansas.
Okay. She was the one-room grades K through 8 all in one class. This pretty girl right here, that's Eleanor. Yeah.
Wow.
This was her 8th.
Even prettier today.
These banners you see around prior to we getting this location in the building, another lady and I, we'd go in and talk to 3rd graders. They got to study local history, so we'd set up 3 or 4 banners and tell them. I always told them what school was like and stuff, but you know, we talked about the farming and the other things, and it's really interesting. Kids come in and say, oh yeah, you came to my school.
Wow.
They like when they ask, how did you get to school back then? Well, sometimes we'd take a horse, or you walk barefoot, you know, it's a different time.
No homework, that always gets them.
Yeah.
I said, well, you did it in school because she wasn't paying attention to you all the time. You had time to do that.
Interesting.
Along the top we put together kind of a timeline, and so the upper part above the dashed line is kind of for a frame of reference what was going on in the world at the time, and then the lower part is what was happening here in Menifee. But it's neat to see, you know, electricity finally made its way here. Doesn't mean that every house had it. That was the very first line came here, and then it could have taken years for each farmhouse to be able to pay to connect. Same thing with telephone, 1957.
This is wonderful.
Yeah. Isn't that neat?
Yeah.
And that's Bell Mountain there, in that picture.
Yeah.
Here's another neat photo, Fred. This is Newport Road, the interchange that just got widened over the freeway.
Right.
There it is, 1970s. Little stop sign, one lane.
Wow.
Nothing but fields on either side. And that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
1970.
Right.
So those are throwback Thursday pictures that the city puts on He does all that work, getting them ready for them.
So the city, you know, that on their Facebook, they wanted throwback Thursday
Right.
items, and so we went through a lot of our photos and tried to pick some interesting ones, but added a little bit of information at the bottom, just so people can understand what it is they're seeing, and provided over 120 of those photos to the city, so they're constantly putting it on their Facebook page, and it just increases their
That's great.
interest. What we're all about here in this History Association is awareness and accuracy. So we want people to learn about and know what was here. It seems like such a new place, Menifee. Oh, it's brand new city of Menifee, but we go back to the 1800s, and we want to make sure that people are telling the story and that they're saying the right things when they see photographs, that it's very clear what it is. So. We've just recently placed 12 monuments. I think that was the one map that you had, and so those are physical concrete monuments in 12 locations of either the schools or the prominent families, or some of the things like the King's Inn restaurant in Sun City and the Quail Valley Lodge up in Quail Valley. But those markers are going to outlast all of us, and so it's kind of a nice way to put
That's
it.
neat.
Community
Yeah, you've
pride.
done that.
Yeah. Quail Valley, it's kind of a special place. You know, when you drive through Quail Valley right now, it seems substandard. There's some one-way streets that are hardly even 15 feet wide. The lots are real tiny, and you might say, how did this happen? Why was this allowed to be built in this style? It has a great story. In the 1800s, there was a gentleman that recognized that the area was teeming with game, so rabbit, quail, dove. He said this would make a great hunting resort, and so he began to develop it when he and some other investors got together and created, at one time it was called the Lake Elsinore Lodge, and then eventually became Quail Valley Lodge and resort area. But he was selling those lots for, what was it, $300-400 a piece?
Hardly anything.
Yeah, hardly anything. And it was, you know, folks from LA that would come out on the weekends and they would hunt, but they really just needed a place to sleep.
Right.
And then go out, get up early and hunt, and then stay, hang out in the lodge afterwards and have dinner. And so that's kind of what he created. And so there's a reason for the substandard style of the development. It's because at the time it was just, that's all that was needed. And
Right.
so, then his son kind of took over after that, and so in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, it kind of became a little bit more of a family resort. You actually had to go through a guard gate to get there. It was for members only. You had to live there, but they had a lodge with a swimming pool. They had equestrian facilities and shuffleboard and lots of fun things for people to do. And they would have parades on the weekend, and it was kind of a special place up until about 1970. And then Charles Cooper's son, who was running it, decided, let's just go ahead and take down the entrance and just let it be a regular community. And it's sort of just taken on a life of its own since then. But when I bring young kids through here, Boys and Girls Club, and I say, do any of you live in Quail Valley? And there's usually a couple that are reluctant, that, you know, almost ashamed, yeah, I do.
Yeah.
But when I get done telling them about the resort and that
They
it was a special
understand.
place, boy, they got that community pride and they're all excited about living in Quail Valley. So it's a good thing. And it's a neat place. It's very, very special. Here's another neat shot. You know, you always hear about the 395 is where the 215 was. And there was, in the 1950s, to be able to, you know, this is a common view that we have now as you're going just past Newport Road and you're headed towards Sun City, towards McCall. But in the 1950s, that was a hill there, and you used to have to kind of get off and go around and work your way down Bradley and back over to Newport to be able to come
Just
south.
as recent as the 1950s.
Yes, and so what prompted that was because March Air Force Base is where it was, and then all those convoys were coming to San Diego for deployment and that sort of thing. And so they were constantly running these convoys down Highway 74 to Lake Elsinore, through Old Town Elsinore, through Old Town Marietta, Winchester, Wildemar.
Right.
These little towns, imagine these convoys, it might take an hour for them to go by, and so it was very disruptive. They go through Old Town Temecula, so they wanted a straighter shot. And so the impetus to create the 395 and have a nice shot right through Menifee was that the state came in and blasted out that hill. They called it the Big Cut, and to create that punch way through. And it came right before Del Webb comes along, so he was loving it. Now he's got
Oh,
a
yeah.
great big freeway on the land that he
Right.
just bought, and so that was next. And so we kind of talked a lot about Sun City and how that was all, how that came about. And remember, he had a Sun City in Arizona in the 1950s that was doing very, very well, and he kind of needed another place for all of his people to continue, so he sort of replicated what he had done in the Arizona Sun City right here. And so some of the things like the King's Inn restaurant and a lot of the street names and all that are very similar to what took place over there in Arizona.
My aunt lives in Sun City West.
Okay,
Over in Arizona.
Yeah, so when you go and see her, you might recognize, hey,
Yeah.
we've got a street that's named this or that, and so it's
Yeah.
very similar. And we have some books that talk about the story of those. These are from newspaper articles back in the 60s. And one other kind of neat thing, we had a gentleman, he's a metal detector, and so when they were building the new McDonald's, which is where the 1890 school was, he was over there detecting as they were turning over and grading, and then they'd all go home, and so he'd go out there and do it real quick, and he found all these coins just right there, and some of them
Wow.
1809, and so he ended up framing them up and said we
What
could,
prizes?
yeah,
Boy.
we could put those here just to kind of show people what was going on. You were asking about Eleanor, where she lives, so here's Canyon Lake.
Right.
So Railroad Canyon's coming up here and it becomes Newport Road. Here's Sun City. There's one house here, right up here on the top of the hill, and no other homes in Canyon Lake in this picture in 1968. This house was Eleanor and Don's house, and they still live in it today.
Wow.
Yeah, so when you go there, it says, see your
5,000 neighbors now.
Yeah.
But they're still in that home up on top of the hill, beautiful house.
Wow.
Great big picture windows looking down at the water. They got a very nice place, but it's neat to see what it looked
Yeah,
like
it is.
before the development came
Right.
along.
Right.
And we just celebrated 50 years of being a
Canyon
Canyon
Lake.
Lake.
That's right.
Wow.
And this kind of tells the story of Canyon Lake, and here's Eleanor and then her parents when they were kind of running the fish camp there, and they had a burger stand and sold bait and rented boats and things like that, and catered to the fishermen and
This is really amazing.